Incredible rancher saves wounded Apache. Just hours later, shocking army encircled his home. Hank McAllister's heart raced as he dragged the Apache man from the brush, away from the scuffling hooves of his cattle. The man lay sprawled, blood matted against his skin, each labored breath a whispered plea echoing through Hank's mind. What had he done? The army was out there, patrolling the land with a relentless grip, and here he was, tying himself to a fugitive. Grit and loyalty had guided him through the sun-baked soil of Arizona. But this was different. This was a choice that could undo everything he knew. As the man grasped Hank's wrist with surprising strength, a flicker of desperation pierced through Hank's typical pragmatism. In his grandfather's stories, they spoke of kinship, honor, and respect for the earth and its people. But the two worlds collided now, twisting a knot of anxiety deep in his gut. Just hours ago, he was a rancher, with cattle to tend and a land to protect. Now he wrestled with dualities. Should he help this man, risking not just his career, but his very life? The army could take him down for this perceived act of treason. Shoving aside his doubts, he snatched up supplies from the barn, torn between urgency and fear. This man had faced a far grimmer reality than Hank ever had. He could see it in the Apache's eyes, dulled with pain yet burning with an unyielding spirit that resonated with Hank. "Just rest," he murmured, though he couldn't rest himself, pacing like a caged animal. They lay in a fragile quiet, constantly listening for thunder on the horizon, locking eyes, sharing a bond forged within the fires of shared suffering. Just then, a crack of thunder rattled through the air. Not the weather. No, it was the sound of approaching hooves. The army was near. Panic set in as Hank's mind stormed with conflicting thoughts. He had always held a reverence for the law, yet the law now marched against everything he believed to be right. It felt as if his ancestors stood beside him, their spirit whispering, "Protect your brother." Hank shifted nervously. Who was he if he turned the other way? Disloyal? Weak? Before we continue, I need to tell you about something important that's happening. YouTube has been making changes to the system, and many people are losing notifications from channels they follow. If you're enjoying the content, click the bell and mark all notifications so you don't miss the next videos. And if you can leave a like, it really helps with reach. Seriously, it makes a difference. Oh, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'm always curious to know who's on the other side of the screen. Now let's continue. As night draped its shadows over the ranch, Hank sat at the threshold, staring down the trail he helped the Apache man escape from. The distant rumble of the approaching troops felt like a tempest brewing within him, reflecting a fear that gnawed deeply. What if they came looking for him? What if they found the Apache? The thoughts twisted in his mind, haunting him, steadily amplifying the pressure in his chest. Duty to country, or duty to this man, this brother he had yet to fully understand? Each tick of his watch echoed loudly, a metronome marking the passage of time as he paced. Would he stand and fight for a soul he saw as worthy? Or would he bow to the very authority that had swallowed his own lineage, turning him cold to the cries of his brothers? In that stark silence, with the flicker of the stars promising nothing but uncertainty, Hank's heart hardened, knowing that tomorrow he would stand on a precipice, forced to choose between the legacy of kinship and the relentless march of greater forces. What price would he pay for the truths threatening to unravel the very essence of who he was? The night air was thick with tension, wrapping itself around Hank like a suffocating shroud. Each creak of wood from the barn and rustle of leaves felt conspicuous, a reminder of the world he was about to embroil himself in. He inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. It was time to confront not just external forces, but the tumult of his own beliefs. How had he come to this point, standing on the edge of defiance, cradling the choice between righteousness and his own survival? The man lying in the shadows of the barn was not just a fugitive. He was a living embodiment of struggles Hank had only ever touched upon in the abstract. As he crouched next to the Apache, Hank studied the contours of his face, creased with pain yet resilient. This was a person who had known loss, a story etched not in words but in the silence of his battered body. For all his previous bravado as a rancher, Hank found himself questioning whether he had the insight to navigate this terrain of moral complexity. He grasped at the notion that perhaps this was the unexpected crucible he needed to redefine the very fabric of his identity. Would courage mean standing apart from his neighbors? The thought terrified and fascinated him, stirring something dormant inside. He had always put duty above all else. Would he risk everything for a stranger? The burgeoning feeling of camaraderie burned deeply, yet the lurking uncertainty over its repercussions festered in the edges of his conscience. Suddenly, the sound of animated voices approached, sending a jolt through Hank's body. The army had arrived. Instinct kicked in as he quickly adjusted the Apache's position, covering him with a hay blanket and trying desperately to mask the signs of distress swirling around them. Despite years spent evading the harsh spotlight of conflict, Hank felt himself stepping into its glaring center. The militia spilled onto his property, their orders crisp against the night sky. Hank clenched his fists, wrestling with the responsibility heavy on his shoulders. These men were his neighbors, once friends who admired his dedication and toughness. Now they presented a wall that stood directly between him and a conviction that stood to reshape his very essence. What if they questioned him? What if suspicion lingered in their tones? These thoughts churned relentlessly in his mind like a ceaseless cyclone. On one side lay the Apache man, battered but alive. On the other stood the soldiers, armed, relentless enforcers of a system that often overlooked the humanity residing beneath their badges. As they encroached further into the yard, Hank's thoughts crystallized into a singular realization. He had to confront them. Fraying connections with the army and triggering a fundamental shift could lead to dire consequences, yet the alternative, surrendering to an oppressive authority, felt like a betrayal to values that coursed through his very blood. In that moment of resolve, a flicker of determination ignited within him, granting clarity. He'd defend the innocent, challenge the impending injustice, and embody the grit he had inherited from generations past. The hour had come to act, to face his fears head-on. With each determined stride toward the uniformed men, Hank felt a deep sense of purpose anchor him. If bravery was to be measured, it would be by standing firm for what was undeniably right. As the soldiers called out to him, Hank swallowed hard, preparing to voice his truth despite the sound of rebellion thrumming in his chest, knowing it could change the course of his life forever. The moment of confrontation rippled with tension, and a new chapter awaited, one in which he must unravel the true cost of loyalty and resilience. Would he remain the man he was, or would he become something new, steeped in courage? Only now could he script his own legacy. The soldiers stood in stark formation, their uniforms highlighted by the dim glow of the barn's lanterns. Hank felt the weight of their eyes, gaze familiar, yet filled with suspicion, bearing down on him. Each command they barked echoed in the back of his mind, deepening the tumult he was attempting to suppress. He could feel the Apache's shallow breath beneath the hay, a reminder of the life hanging in the balance depending on his next words. As he took a step forward, doubt swirled within him like a tempest. Would they see his defiance as rebellion? Would they consider a man protecting a stranger as a threat? The familiar faces of his neighbors turned to silhouettes of authority, erasing the camaraderie they once shared. This was not the time to retreat. The very essence of his identity was at stake. "Hey, Hank!" One of the soldiers, a burly man named Joe, stepped forward, eyebrows furrowed. "What's going on here? We heard there's a fugitive hiding on your property." Joe's tone bordered on the accusatory, and Hank felt flames licking at the edges of his resolve. "I don't know what you're talking about," Hank lied, trying to keep his voice steady. The words felt foreign in his mouth, laden with a weight that threatened to crack his carefully constructed facade. Joe narrowed his eyes. "We don't have time for games. We're conducting a search. Step aside." As tension crackled between the two men, Hank fought back a wave of fear that threatened to overwhelm him. Every instinct screamed to comply, to keep the peace and maintain security. But then he recalled the humanity of the wounded man hidden behind him. Fear and courage danced within him, daring him to stand firm. "No," he finally said, his heart pounding like a drum, each beat urging him to clarify. "He's not a fugitive. He's a man in need of help." Hank's words hung in the air, heavy and defiant. The communal air of the barn seemed to absorb his declaration, rendering the moment still. The soldier's face twisted in confusion, and Joe took an aggressive step forward. "You're risking everything, Hank. You might even face charges for this." His words were laced with the unspoken threat of exile from their community. In that charged silence, Hank felt a pulse of clarity flood his mind. This was more than a defense of the Apache, it was a confrontation with his own identity. Every external conflict reflected the inner turmoil that had simmered beneath the surface for years. Would he remain the man who always played it safe? Or could he, for once, embrace the turmoil and reshape the man he was meant to become? The realization swept over him like a tide, filling him with a strength he hadn't anticipated. I'd rather risk everything standing for what is right than remain silent in the face of injustice. As the words spilled from his mouth, he sensed a shift within himself. Suddenly the barn felt less like an enclosure and more like a pivotal ground for his transformation. This was not about loyalty to his neighbors, but loyalty to his values, his humanity. Joe's expression faltered for a moment, a flicker of doubt in his unwavering stance, but he quickly regained composure, challenging Hank's words head-on. You think you're being noble? Think of your family, your ranch, all for a stranger. It was a taut moment, thick with conflicting emotions. Hank considered the truth buried in Joe's warning. Family and ranch were essential, yet what kind of man would he be if he allowed fear to dictate his choices? As the standoff intensified, Hank's decision loomed over him. He could feel the shift crackling in the air, his stomach knotting with anxiety, yet beneath it was a simmering determination. Would he stand by the Apache at the cost of everything he held dear? The weight of the impending choice pressed down on him. Yes, he finally said, voice unwavering, I will stand for what's right. As the gravity of his declaration sunk in, a cascade of consequences loomed on the horizon. Would his declaration of loyalty steer him toward redemption or toward destruction? The path forward promised only uncertainty, and in that moment, Hank felt the full brunt of his metamorphosis crashing over him. With every heartbeat, the stakes grew, leaving Hank to wonder what kind of man would emerge from this confrontation. And behind him, in the shadows of the barn, the Apache's life hung in the balance. What would the cost of his courage demand, and could he bear the weight of that commitment? Hank's heart hammered in his chest, each beat reverberating through the barn like an alarm bell. The soldiers were no longer just neighbors. They had transformed into an intimidating force, eyes narrowed and ready for confrontation. Hank was awash in adrenaline, feeling as though he had ignited a fuse that could burn down everything he had built over the years. Joe stepped closer, focusing all his weighty authority on Hank. You don't know what you're doing, he warned, voice low, menacing. Next thing you know, you'll be facing the wrath of men who don't take kindly to your kind of meddling. The threat was clear, but for the first time, Hank felt clarity cut through his fear. He was no longer the man who shrank from conflict. Instead, he recognized an inner resolve. He could stand here anchored in his conviction, or he could cower under their scrutiny. Both options held consequences, but only one felt right. For too long, I've avoided standing up for what matters, Hank thought, forcing himself to remain still despite the gravity of the moment. Each harsh glare from the soldiers only fueled a fire in him. Help isn't just a word, Hank said, trying to meet Joe's gaze boldly. It's an action. That man needs saving, and I will not turn my back on him. Joe's frustration boiled over. You think this is about an Apache? This is about you being foolish. You're making an enemy of the very people who keep this town running. Hank felt his resolve falter. The reality of potential isolation struck him hard, like a cold blast of winter air. He could envision mornings without the other farmers, faces cast away as he walked through town, perpetually branded as the traitor. But the thought of allowing fear to govern him left a bitter taste in his mouth. They're not protecting anyone if they're hunting down a man in need, Hank shot back, finding strength in his tone. You've all seen the injustices. Are you really ready to be the ones who stand by and let it happen? In the silence, he felt a shift. Those closest to him, the ones who had shared their lives on the wheat fields and the dusty lanes, seemed uncertain. Hank was no longer just a voice in the crowd. He was the standard-bearer of a new path, one that struck at the core of who he wanted to be. This confrontation was no longer simply about protecting an Apache. It was about redefining every choice he had made as a rancher, as a man. Doubts still lingered, but they were now woven into the tapestry of his determination rather than hanging above him like a sword. However, Joe's harsh laugh broke through his contemplations. You think bravery will keep those men off your porch? The army won't care about your moral choices when they come for you. You think you're noble, but you're about to turn your back on everyone who's stood by you. Every word was a dagger, pricking at memories of camaraderie, laughs shared over bonfires. Yet Hank realized those memories were the past, tethering him to a life he no longer found fulfilling. Then came a sound that shifted the entire atmosphere, a rustling from the hay. Hank spun around, adrenaline flooding back. Could it be the Apache? Movement in the shadows drew Joe's attention. His awareness shifted, and panic emanated from the soldiers. Hank seized the moment, not just to protect the man hidden behind the hay, but to reclaim his purpose. Let him go, Hank urged. He's not the enemy, I am. This declaration hung thick in the air, and for the first time, Hank stepped firmly into the shoes of the man he aspired to become. But the soldiers shifted, gripped by confusion and perhaps unease with what lay ahead. Hank felt an overwhelming charge in the air, a sensation he both feared and craved. Stand your ground, Hank, he murmured to himself, beckoning the strength he had unearthed. The walls of the barn echoed with what felt like distant thunder as the fate of the Apache and the fabric of his life danced on the precipice. Just as clarity returned, Joe took a defensive posture, signaling the army's heightened readiness to react. The stillness before the storm loomed large, as uncertainty seemed poised to shatter the fragile peace of the barn. As Hank drew in a breath, preparing for the reactions that lay ahead, one transcendent thought struck him. This was just the beginning of a chapter where personal sacrifice could cultivate the courage of a hero, or ignite the wrath of a community bound by tradition but governed by fear. The stakes were rising, and Hank prepared himself to confront not only the army, but the ghosts lurking within the walls of his own convictions. What would he be willing to sacrifice for the sake of just one man? The tension in the barn crackled like charged air before a storm, and Hank could almost taste the fear and uncertainty mingling with the dust. He stood resolute, feeling every heartbeat echo through the silence, a metronome marking the gravity of the moment. The soldiers' confusion lingered thick in the air, laden with the potential for violence, but for the first time, Hank had opted to confront his reality instead of retreating into the shadows. There was a freedom in this decision, yet it came with a heavy cost. Images of his neighbors' faces flashed through his mind, lives intertwined with his by years of shared toil, laughter, and sorrow. But beneath that nostalgia lay the suffocating weight of conformity, a desperate urge for acceptance that had kept him silent for too long. The rustling continued, and as Hank's gaze drifted toward the source, he saw a pair of eyes peering at him from behind the hay. The battered Apache was watching, his expression unreadable, but Hank could almost feel the man's desperation, his unvoiced appeal for help. It ignited something in Hank, a fierce determination that pushed him to stand even taller. Do what you must, Hank addressed the soldiers, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling around him. But know this, I will not allow you to harm him. Joe's jaw tightened, but now it was not just a battle of wills between Hank and the soldiers. The eyes of everyone present were on him. He could feel their expectations, the unspoken questions hanging heavily. Was he truly prepared to bear the weight of their scorn and potential repercussions? As his mind raced, he struggled to reconcile the image of a man solely focused on his own safety with the figure emerging before him, a man who would protect another, regardless of cost. Foolishness will only lead to destruction, Joe spat, edging forward, arms crossing defiantly. Hank's resolve wavered for a fraction of a second as the prospect of isolation threatened to envelop him. But he quickly banished those thoughts. And what of your actions? Is it not foolish to hunt a man when we all know the true enemy is fear itself? His words hung in the air, teasing reactions from the assembled group. An uneasy murmur rippled through the soldiers. Some exchanged glances, and Hank sensed a shift. This was no longer solely about him. He was untangling the knots of complicity that had long binded his fellow ranchers. Everyone knew the reality, yet few were willing to speak against it. Hank was now the voice of dissent, and that role came with the allure of danger. Let him walk away, he pressed, his voice firm and unwavering. He deserves mercy more than any of us. In that moment, Hank realized the weight of his choice. No longer a passive witness, he was the architect of a new future, for himself and perhaps for others. As the soldiers continued to hesitate, Hank could feel something stirring within him. It was a sense of agency, a newfound capacity to inspire change. His heart raced not with fear but with a deep-seated belief that this path, though fraught with peril, was the true embodiment of courage. Actively rejecting the life others had prescribed for him, an identity crafted from fear and submission, he started to thrum with potential. What other facets of himself lay dormant, waiting to be drawn out by the urgency of the moment? But just as hope bloomed, the tension shattered as one soldier raised his weapon, snapping Hank back to the present with a jolt. An instinctive survival mechanism kicked in, triggering all of Hank's senses. "Step back," Joe barked, taking a protective stance, yet Hank was no longer willing to step back. The stakes pushed higher, every breath a reminder of the man he was becoming, a protector, a challenger of the status quo. As the looming face-off intensified, Hank understood that this confrontation was not merely about the Apache's fate. It was about his own transformation, discovering strengths buried beneath layers of hesitation. The air buzzed with potential for both conflict and resolution. This was merely the beginning. Whatever unfolded next would not only reshape Hank's existence, but also test the very limits of who he thought he could become. Would he rise to fully embrace this newfound power, or would fear stop him cold? The answer was veiled in uncertainty as the first shot rang out, echoing against the quiet walls of the barn. The crack of the shot resonated like a thunderclap, reverberating within Hank's chest as he squared his shoulders, defiant against the chaotic maelstrom unfolding around him. Every nerve in his body surged with adrenaline. This was no longer just about saving the Apache. It was a potent moment of reckoning. His decisions were being carved into the marrow of his identity, shaping a man who was willing to fight for justice. The soldier's finger trembled on the trigger, and Hank fought to keep his breathing steady. Lives dangled in the balance, and he was painfully aware that his courage, or lack thereof, could mean the difference between life and death. The desperation that had washed over him moments earlier now solidified into an iron resolve. He was not merely protecting the Apache, he was forging his own path down a road laced with danger. "Stand down!" Hank's voice erupted, fiercer than he had intended. In that moment, he wasn't just a rancher, he was a force of nature, an embodiment of resistance against the crushing weight of conformity. Joe, visibly shaken, tried to reassert control. "Hank, you're making a mistake. Get out of the way." His tone, layered with concern and frustration, warned of potential fallout, yet Hank felt that this was the pivot point for both their fates. Reflecting on his years of quiet acquiescence, the way he had tiptoed around the opinions of others, the truth crystallized. He could no longer stay safely ensconced in ignorance of the wider world. This was a moment of personal upheaval. He either stepped into the light or retreated into the shadows, and he had every intention of stepping forward. Hank turned, meeting the Apache's eyes. There was a shared understanding that transcended words. The man was not merely a victim, he was a symbol of everything Hank had pushed aside for the sake of comfort. Pointing at the soldiers, Hank proclaimed, "You want to fight? Then let us push against the shackles of fear, and let it be known we will do so together." The air crackled with tension as soldiers shifted uneasily, their pockmarked brows furrowing in confusion. They had entered the barn expecting compliance, but now they were watching a man embrace his awakening. In that fragile moment, Hank felt the eyes of his community upon him, drawing equal parts awe and trepidation. But Joe seized the moment to step forward, raising his weapon defiantly. "This will end badly for all of us, Hank. You're risking everything." His warning curled around Hank's thoughts, twisting with anxiety. What did it mean to risk everything? As Hank considered the cost of silence he had borne for too long, it became clear that the true cost of surrender was far greater. Breaking from his brother's challenge, Hank was acutely aware of the budding strength that emerged from his heart. There was a fierce resolve beneath it all, a burning desire not just to confront fear but to redefine it, to wrestle its grip from those who sought to perpetuate it. "Then let it end," he replied, voice low as he stepped closer to Joe. "But understand this, I will not stand by and watch an innocent man die today." What lay ahead was uncertain, but Hank could feel the weight of his resolve settling comfortably. He was igniting a fire within himself, the flames crackling with the promise of defiance and justice. The soldiers, seized with hesitation, appeared to be looking deeper within their own souls, caught off guard by Hank's fierce conviction. With urgency building, the Apache's presence struck a chord deep within Hank, bringing clarity. He was not alone. The soldiers must see that the man before them was more than just a shadow. They too had dormant powers, buried under layers of fear. The first murmurs bubbled from among the soldiers, whispers of doubt and the haunting acknowledgement of a choice to decide their path. Inside that barn stood not just a line drawn in the sand, but the beginning of an unshackled truth rattling against the corners of fear. But suddenly, from beyond the barn walls, a cacophony of approaching footsteps drew closer, a harbinger of the impending storm. The echo of boots against the ground filled the night air, and Hank's breath hitched, instinctively knowing that this was only a prelude to turmoil yet unseen. The looming chaos promised confrontation, forcing Hank to sharpen his focus. Would he stand tall against this challenge, or would the cost of his convictions fracture under the weight of new fears? Hank's heart raced as the heavy thudding of boots filled his ears, dousing his earlier fire of defiance with an icy grip of urgency. He had stepped into a conflict that could redefine him, yet as he stood there, he felt the ground beneath him shifting in ways he couldn't control. The uncertain fate of the Apache weighed heavier with each footfall approaching the barn. His thoughts ping-ponged between the soldier raised against him and the Apache, still too silent in his corner. Every man assembled in that dusty barn was tethered to the choices Hank had made, and his resolve surged like an electric current. This moment wasn't simply about protecting another, it was the threshold of self-discovery, an awakening to potential and responsibility he had long suppressed. "Stay close, Apache," Hank admonished, struggling to keep his emotions from bubbling over. "We'll face this together." The Apache nodded, eyes narrow and steady. A flicker of understanding passed between them, a bond forged in the crucible of imminent danger. Joe shifted anxiously, the weapon lowering slightly in his grasp. "You think this is the right time?" The underlying dread in his voice echoed Hank's inner turmoil. Was it truly the right time, or was he inviting catastrophe? As the footsteps drew nearer, Hank closed his eyes for a heartbeat, mentally sorting through his scattered thoughts like pieces of a shattered picture. He felt an ember ignite in his chest. A realization struck him with clarity, a sense of purpose transcending fear. He had lived too long on the sideline, accommodating others while denying his own essence. This confrontation could be the catalyst for a new version of himself, one that was unyielding, not just a passive participant. Movement outside the barn reclaimed his attention. Shadows loomed large, their outlines stark against the dim light filtering through cracks in the wood. Tension thickened the air, and Hank sensed the shifting allegiances among the soldiers. They were caught in a quagmire of choice, wrestling with loyalties at odds with their instincts. With that realization came the undeniable truth. Many of these soldiers were merely men, a combination of fear, valor, and moral conflict. The door creaked open, and a squad of soldiers entered, their expressions unreadable masks brimming with tension. One soldier stepped forward, an authoritative presence, scanning the room with the efficiency of a predator sizing up prey. Hank squared his shoulders, his voice steady against the encroaching uncertainty. "Stop! You're here for him, but if you draw that weapon, you invite your own chaos." "So you think you can hold us off?" the soldier replied, voice oscillating between disbelief and amusement. One man against an army? Hank felt the challenge simmering. His world had been a series of calculated retreats and unspoken fears, but he now stood at the edge of a precipice, ready to leap. It's not about the number of men, it's about the courage to act. Would his words resonate? Could they thaw the iceberg of fear suffocating the men before him? Silence enveloped them, a heavy, crackling tension, thick enough to slice with a knife. The Apache's presence grew remarkable, sending a ripple of discomfort through the soldiers, rooted in their own quiet reckoning. Had Hank inadvertently ignited a spark of doubt? "What if we refuse to stand down?" another soldier challenged, voice laced with menace. A hushed anger simmered beneath the surface. Hank could see it, the latent frustration waiting to explode. Then you will initiate a fight where none need exist, Hank countered, feeling the underlying urgency build as determination flooded his veins. As he faced the soldiers, he wasn't just a rancher anymore. He was a catalyst for something unforeseen. The great churning for change loomed large over him, swaying everyone present. Could he bear the weight of his convictions in the face of brutality? Or would he fracture under the collective intensity of their doubts? The truth loomed, and he felt its insistent pull toward revelation. His history would inform this moment, but what would his future look like? The thunder of footsteps faded, but left an undeniable echo within him. As anticipation hung in the air, the crowd of soldiers seemed poised for action. But so was Hank. He could sense the moment teetering on a knife's edge, a chasm wide enough to swallow ideals. The question pulsed at the forefront of his mind. Would he become an anthem of defiance or a casualty of his own hesitation? The choice loomed, an impending clarity urging him forward. Hank's breath came in shallow bursts, the weight of expectation pressing heavily upon him. This was no ordinary test. It was a crucible, and he was the metal being forged. The soldiers loomed before him, their gaze calculating, their intentions opaque. He understood that one misstep could lead to chaos. His hand clenched involuntarily. He needed to steer this moment with precision. Courage to act, he muttered under his breath, uncertain if the echo of his own words could inspire confidence. Deep down, he could hear the whispers of doubt that had taunted him for years. The defiant spark he felt minutes before flickered beneath shadowed trepidation. "Look," he started, forcing himself to project a calmness he didn't entirely possess. "You think this is about loyalty to orders, but it's also about humanity. The choices we make here dictate the kind of men we want to be." They shifted, some confused, others resolute. Had he touched a nerve? He couldn't afford to back down now. It became clear, this was not just about saving the Apache. This was about redefining his own identity and tackling the suffocating fear that had been his companion for too long. The authoritative soldier stepped closer, assessing him with sharp scrutiny. "You think a few words will change anything? What are you, some kind of hero?" "Not a hero," Hank replied, surprising even himself with his clarity. "Just a man willing to stand up when it matters." His heart thundered in his chest, each beat a drum summoning latent courage. With every passing moment, Hank felt a part of him break free, forged in the fire of conflict. He was a man immersed in the chaos, not merely standing aside, but stepping into the center. Yet the realization that his transformation came through an act of defiance brought a rush of dread. Would the men before him ever accept him? Would he accept himself? "Acting on conviction may lead us all into uncertainty." Joe's voice trembled, visibly shaken, and his grip on the weapon tightened. "What if this provokes them? What if they retaliate?" "Then let them," Hank countered fiercely. "Let them retaliate against a man who chose to protect someone in need." Each word glimmered with a raw honesty he had long buried. "But know this, you have the power to choose who you are in this moment. You don't have to be soldiers brainwashed into blind obedience. You can be men who decide to fight for something greater than orders." As he spoke, a flicker of recognition danced in the eyes of a few soldiers. Hank noticed remnants of the hard veneer beginning to crack. Perhaps they were also grappling with their identities, acknowledging the impulse to rebel within their own souls. If he hadn't realized it before, he understood now. Every person there, even the man in a uniform pointing a weapon at him, faced the same inner turmoil. "Your fear doesn't define you," he pressed on, now fueled by the possibility of connection. "Use it. You can choose courage instead. We can choose a different path together." A silence enveloped them, the stillness pregnant with potential. The branches of fate turned, and Hank felt himself standing on the cusp of a pivotal moment. He wouldn't walk away as the man he arrived. He seized the moment, aligning his destiny with a purposeful intent. Then, from the rear, a heavy footfall drew his attention. Fear knotted his stomach. Another soldier? Another threat? The crowded room swirled with uncertainty again as the door swung open once more. Smoky air rushed in, and for the first time, Hank felt despair threading its way through his heart. The finality of the decision weighed heavily. The price of change often meant embracing unexpected challenges. He needed to be ready. Was he prepared for what lay beyond this immediate confrontation? As another soldier materialized, tension spiked, and Hank understood with chilling clarity he was thus the fulcrum of an impending shift, leading them toward an uncharted future. Fingers trembling, he steadied his breath. He had ignited something. The question was, could he extinguish the fire that flared in response? Would they raise their weapons, transformed by conviction? Or would they pull the trigger on the potential for a future he yearned for? His hands clenched tighter, focusing all his resolve. This was not merely a moment. It was the genesis of his emergence, and he would fight to remain standing amidst the storm of chaos. Could he solidify their newfound resolve, or would he tremble once more in the face of overwhelming fear? The next moment loomed, and his heart raced in anticipation of what was to come. The heavy footfall echoed ominously in the charged room, and Hank turned to face the source of the disturbance. It was Ledger, a seasoned sergeant known for his unyielding resolve. His arrival shifted the atmosphere, like a sudden gust reshaping the landscape around Hank. Ledger's eyes searched the crowd. Those eyes, once seemingly indifferent, now burned with scrutiny as they locked onto Hank. "This ends now," Ledger announced, voice booming, slicing through the silence like a sharp knife. The weight of his authority pressed down on the soldiers, crystallizing their uncertainty into a palpable tension. Hank faced him, heart racing but pulse steadying. This was the moment. The confrontation slipped away from the abstract and into the concrete. "What are you talking about?" Hank shot back, emboldened by a surge of defiance. He had tasted the air of rebellion, and embers of his newfound identity ignited once more. "We're standing at a crossroads, and you know it as well as I do." Ledger stepped forward. "You're not leading these men into a fantasy, Hank. You're inviting chaos. It's clear you've been taken by some hero complex. Do you even see the consequences if you push this any further?" "Maybe you're too comfortable with the status quo," Hank countered, the words slipping out with a fierceness that surprised him. "Staying silent while injustice prevails just makes you part of the problem." As he engaged with warring thoughts of caution and boldness, Hank sensed an internal shift. With each word, he reaffirmed his identity, not merely as an ordinary rancher, but as a symbol of change. Recognition flickered across the faces of the soldiers. In that moment, they were not just men with rifles. They were young men trapped in an ideology, searching desperately for purpose. Ledger hesitated, a crack forming in his stern demeanor. "You think you can walk away from this consequence-free? That there won't be fallout?" "That's exactly what I'm afraid of," Hank admitted, his voice lowering. It was a moment of vulnerability that drew Ledger in. "But isn't apathy worse? What kind of men do we want to be? Courageous but afraid? Or afraid and doing nothing?" A murmur rippled through the soldiers, a growing awareness that they were witnessing something significant. Hank felt the flow of power shift as he began to challenge not only Ledger's views, but also the collective fear binding them. "Right here," he continued, his tone steady yet impassioned, "we can define our future. This isn't just about one Apache. This is about dignity, respect, about us reclaiming our identities as men of honor." That recognition hung heavy in the air, dangerously close to spilling over into clarity. Hank was no longer merely talking at them. He was peeling back layers of institutional conditioning that had kept them unsuspecting. But doubt seized him again. Was he truly capable of conducting such an intricate dance? Could he lead them from the brink of violence to understanding? Ledger leaned in closer, the remnants of authority swirling like smoke between them. "And if we don't believe in your cause? If you're wrong, what then?" "I'd rather be wrong for standing up than right while sitting down and doing nothing." The air was electric, charged with a dangerous possibility. It pulled the men in like a tide, and Hank sensed the shifts in their resolve. Faces once taut with skepticism grew softer, opening up like petals in unseasonable sunlight. But Ledger, reckless as a storm, remained a powerful presence, rooted in tradition, challenging Hank not just as a soldier, but as a man shaped by fear of change. "Your words might inspire, Hank," he warned softly, "but you're playing with fire. Are you ready for the fallout?" Hank's pulse quickened at the stakes being laid bare. This was not merely a philosophical discourse anymore, but a defining moment that could thread through history. He felt the dawning realization. It wasn't just his fate on the line, it was theirs too. Sweating under the weight of the challenge, Hank prepared for his final card. Then let's face it together. If courage means risking everything, then let's stand together and claim our futures, together. The tension gripped the room like a vice. Each soldier seemed to weigh his words against the fear choking their silence. Hank understood fully. He stood not just as a man, but as the embodiment of their choice. Individual resolve against a tide of expectations. Could he unite them, or would the decision to act rest solely on the razor's edge of his courage? With breaths held, time stretched into eternity, standing at the precipice of a choice that could shatter or reshape everything they knew. What would happen when the fire ignited, and who would be consumed in the flames? The silence in the barn grew unbearable, stretching out with anticipation. Hank's heart raced, but he stood firm, every fiber of his being locked onto the moment. He had stepped into a new realm, defined not by the rancher he once was, but by the man he had chosen to become. Ledger stared at him, the weight of decades of tradition radiating from his stance. Yet within that indomitable exterior, Hank sensed a glimmer, a tiny spark yearning for freedom. "I am ready for whatever consequences come," Hank stated, his voice steady, yet filled with the unmistakable pulse of defiance. "If we refuse to act, we become complicit in our own fears." Suddenly, ripples of realization seemed to vibrate through the crowd of soldiers. Each man, including Ledger, was confronted with a choice, both terrifying and exhilarating. Hank noticed eyes glistening not with fear, but with an awakening. Shadows of uncertainty began to lift as the soldiers wrestled with their own convictions, internal battles lined with threads of struggle. "Fear is an illusion," Hank pressed on, feeling the energy shift. "The real danger comes from inaction. You aren't just protecting the system, you're binding yourself to this cycle of injustice." He could feel the tide turning beneath him, a reformation bubbling up that demanded to be expressed. For the first time, he felt powerful, not just for himself, but for the Apache hiding behind him, whose life hung in the balance of their choices. "What does it mean to be brave?" Hank posed, eyes fixed on Ledger. "It means elevating dignity above orders. It means reclaiming our humanity." Without breaking contact with Hank's gaze, Ledger was silent, a maelstrom of doubt and contemplation swirling in his mind. He turned his head slightly, appearing to search for support among his fellow soldiers, a community that now seemed fragile, teetering on the edge of a deeper understanding. Hank locked eyes with the Apache, who nodded almost imperceptibly, a quiet declaration of trust that stirred something deep within Hank, a sense of responsibility and clarity he had never known. He stepped forward, acknowledging the Apache's pain, and stood unflinchingly beside him. "If we allow fear to dictate our actions today," Hank reiterated, his voice rising with fervor, "we may never get another chance to choose compassion over conflict." Finally, Ledger took a deep breath, shifting his weight and slowly lowering his weapon. "You're asking for a lot, Hank," he murmured, the edge of authority breaking down as vulnerability seeped through. "I'm asking you to choose," Hank replied, feeling the weight of that moment, a tipping point echoing through the barn like a bell tolling for freedom. "Choose what kind of men you aspire to be." With that, something remarkable occurred. One by one, soldiers began to lower their weapons and exchange glances. Breaths once held tight, now easing. The steadfastness in Hank's unwavering conviction became a mirror that reflected their own burgeoning courage. As Ledger stepped back, relinquishing the stronghold of authority he maintained for so long, the tension erupted in the barn, transformed from coils of fear to threads of solidarity. Shackles slipped off as they recognized that true power is not granted but taken, forged by choices rooted in integrity rather than compliance. "What will you do?" Hank pressed once more, his voice a mixture of challenge and invitation. A ripple of uncertainty danced among the troops, the gravity of impending danger becoming apparent. "We'll choose to stand," one soldier finally declared, echoing the commitment that had etched itself in their hearts. The air crackled with energy. It was the birth of a collective resolve echoing Hank's bravery. Exhilaration surged through him as Hank realized that today marked the culmination of his transformation. No longer just the rancher trapped within the bounds of tradition, he had evolved into a beacon for those around him. The Apache, now free from the shadows, slowly stepped forward as silence fell over the barn. Hank could feel the collective acknowledgement woven between them, a singular thread of humanity that bound them in purpose, courage, and mutual respect. "One step at a time," Hank murmured, realizing not only did he save a man today, but he had forged new identities within every soldier present. "We'll move forward together." With deliberate strides, they took their first steps as men shaped by choice, a choice to serve and protect, not just their land, but the dignity of all human beings. Hank felt fulfillment coursing through him, punctuated by solid confidence. He stood there, surrounded by not only the force of change, but a profound sense of achievement as they ventured into the unknown future. This was not merely a victory, it was the turning point of their legacy. Each of them had proven their worth by standing against fear and making a stand for compassion. Hank knew he would never be the same again, and the possibilities that lay before them were infinite. The sun began to rise, casting warm light through the barn, illuminating their path. This was the moment of new beginnings, both for Hank McAllister and for all who stood alongside him. The legacy of courage arose not just in fighting battles, but in fostering a commitment to integrity and humanity that would echo for generations to come. Now, as Hank walked forward with purpose, he found strength in both the anguish and the triumph of this pivotal moment, having fully emerged a renewed man, resolute in heart and spirit. Each of us can become that force of change, should we find the courage to act. Subscribe immediately to the channel to not miss the next exclusive emotional stories. Leave a like now to feed the algorithm and show that these stories matter. Comment your reactions and theories about the ending below. We want to hear your voice. Share instantly this video with at least 5 friends who need to see this conclusion. Don't wait even one more second to share this powerful message.